Well, good evening. This is discussion question number 4 in the case study I picked on. This will be the Great Lakes Storm of 1913. Again, this is Emergency Services Disaster Planning class. And here we go. So a little critique of the case study. The case study discusses in November 1913 Great Lakes Storm. It goes at it from a point of you being the city manager of a Midwest port city, which there's a bunch of them along there. Discussion covers events in the city and then also the Great Lakes, because it talks about a lot more actually about the city than it does what happens on lakes. It talks about the ships sinking out there, and that there were several that sunk and that clogged up the ports and everything, which really wasn't totally true. Some of them were out there in the middle of the Great Lakes when they did sink. The book gives the date of the November 7th, where actually it started on November 13th of 1913. And two of the Great Lakes that were involved were Lake Superior and Lake Huron, however you pronounce that, Huron. Hopefully I spelled that correctly on there. Why or what was learned from this case study? 1913, a couple things, I'll go a little bit out of order from a PowerPoint. They did have a way of predicting storms. They were able to look at barometers, which they didn't even use. In fact, on a couple of the areas that I read about it, it said that barometers were available, which would show change in pressure. And if any of us from Florida who've tracked hurricanes, we know when the barometric pressure is lower, that we're looking at a more dangerous storm. And they would look at it, but nobody knew how to use it. So most of them would just hang their hats on it. They all have barometers in their port houses, on their ships, all kind of things like this, but they wouldn't even deal with it. So they ignored a lot about this. There were weather predictions out there, which they told them that the weather was going to be bad. I don't think any of them ever thought it would happen that way. There was a rapid weather change. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, what it shows is you had a cold front and a warm front coming together, which caused this. And in fact, that the day before the storm hit, it was actually, as they called it, like an Indian summer, a balmy November day, but then the weather changed rapidly on there. Communications and other lines were damaged according to the case study itself, which is where a lot of the problems they had. They didn't really mention anything about power, and I don't know if electrical power was really as big right at that point, if they had so much, but they talked about the communication lines being down where they couldn't contact really the outside world from that area. And then they also talked about streets needed to be cleared because they relied a lot on the shipping from the Great Lakes. I've only been to the Great Lakes a few times myself, and I remember just how massive it was. I think I was in Muskogee or Muscatatuck or somewhere. I went somewhere out there and ended up to something with a military training. I ended up going out there and seeing the Great Lakes and noticing fog come in, and they're like an ocean. It's a freshwater thing. I mean, some of these ships that they had that were transporting were 500-foot long ships. So it's a very major thing to happen out there. So they relied on the ships to do a lot of the things. So they had to come back and have to hope that the streets would be cleared. Well, why I selected this study, I'm born and raised in Florida. It wasn't until many years after I was an adult that I actually first got in snow. The coldest I'd ever been and the most snow I'd ever been was Fort Drum, New York. And hopefully never have to be there. It was below zero in the, I think, 18, 19 below zero, and wind, I don't know, far as considered to me, it was 100 below zero because I'm not used to it. So I've never really dealt with these type of emergencies. Florida, the one that I pulled up here offline to look at, and actually it's part of my deposit photo account that I get the photos off of for all these. The December 23rd, 1989 storm that went through, and also on Christmas Day came out too right after that. That was I was actually district officer with Marion County Fire Rescue at that time. And I remember I was in charge of the county, more or less like a battalion chief for that day. It was just called a different name by then. And we had all the roads were iced over. We were wrecking trucks. We had structure fires. It was just a mess. But, there was trace snow. There was very cold temperatures that day, and just bad. Everything was just, we're not used to it. So I thought it was interesting to pick this because I didn't know anything about this event. I read the case study, then I went ahead and started pulling up some articles through the UF library and found a bunch of things about, never really knew about this event that they had, and then learned a lot about the Great Lakes too on it. So it was kind of interesting on that. A little bit of additional information on there. We think about if we put this into today's events, it would be more of a massive power outage with the ice on the power lines and the immediate cold temperature change and the snowfall that came down and ice and everything like that. You'd have just massive power outages, which would probably in the end be the worst part than anything, because people would be out of power and probably not able to adjust the way they were back then, because there was a lot of wood stoves, there was a lot of heating in that way. People use lamps, and just not what we have now. So it'd probably be more devastating for that. The roads would need to be cleared as they had with this. One of the interesting things on the case study is they said they took 5 groups of Boy Scouts out to dig out the hydrants in case of fires. I wonder if their hydrant system in 1913 was even, the dry type cylinders or whatever they had to have at that point there that even made a difference, if they did have a fire. I thought it was kind of strange. So road clearing, I'm sure they would need that, the salting of the roads and all those type of things. They had a hurricane force, that's supposed to be force, not form, storms for days on it that lasted over several days throughout the whole area. This wasn't just a localized storm. This was a massive storm that went through. And like I said earlier, I think if it was in today's world, it would be more of a damage to the city than where most everything is emphasized on the what happened on the ports and out on the lakes to the ships that were in there. Basic overview of it. So they knew about the storms. They knew November was known for bad storms. In fact, they always they had a name for it, and they knew that they saw them, that the weather would change rapidly from the fronts that would come in from the north and the south, which was actually a tropical force from the south that came up that far. And then from the north, we know that what we see coming off Canada and everything. So, and overall, they lost 12 ships. And by the, I guess going back and critiquing a little bit about the case study, it said that the 12 ships were lost at a port and jammed it up. I said before, some of them were lost out into the Great Lakes themselves. In fact, there's one that's still missing. A couple of them were found in the 1980s from divers, and things just weren't recovered what they were. One was washed up shore that it looks like it almost, they say, might have sunk and came back up because the props were torn off of it. They did have warnings for this. They had storm flags up. They actually had different colored lanterns at the time, which told them that there would be hurricane force winds and all at that time. But at that time, they really didn't ever consider a hurricane type event like that, or winds that strong could actually be on the Great Lakes. They just didn't really take that into account. Food and heating supplies were shut off in the case study on that, and that was the big concern. And that would be the major concern if it happened today. Like I said, power outages wouldn't be handled as well today as they would have been then, because they weren't dependent on electric. They were more worried about their communication lines that were out to call for the outside help. But as you see, when everything's shut down, there's no fuel, there's no nothing. I'm not sure how generators would work on all this type of event. I'm pretty sure they would probably survive. But as a city manager, you'd have to plan. It's something completely different than what I would ever plan for. Because what do we think of? Or Florida, us there in Florida, we think of hurricanes come, we never think of ice storms, snowstorms. Maybe in the panhandle, you think a little bit about freezing temperatures and all. But for us here, we're not going to think about the type of things that you're going to see up in the far north, mostly with the temperatures and the weather changes like this. So pretty good, case study on here. Look forward to the next one. Our references are same as usual, went through and used our textbook and then some of the others, and then always use deposit photos. This isn't a sales pitch, but I always use deposit photos so that I don't have any problems with downloading any pictures on here. So, all right, we will see you on the next one. Thanks.